So yeah, I am filling in for someone who got sick. So, but I kind of want to tell a story of Docker Magento, there's a few things I'll get into in a second. But a little about me. My name is Mark Shust. I have two 9-year-old girls, twin girls, and I'm married. Live in North Royalton, Ohio, about 20 minutes south of Cleveland. And I've been a PHP and Magento developer for a long time. And at the moment, I am a Magento teacher for my own company, M Academy. It's really the simplest way to learn Magento. If you're looking to train yourself or your team, it's a great resource. There's over 10,000 students registered on the platform and almost 800 university subscribers. So it's pretty awesome how big that became. And you can also follow me if you want to learn more at Mark Shust is my handle on all of the networks. So today I kind of want to talk about the story behind Docker Magento. Not many people know how it started and why the certain development choices have been made the way they were. I'd like to also talk about file system limitations and workarounds of Docker. It's really important, and it's kind of a nuanced area that a lot of people deal with. And also containerization efficiency. Running Docker isn't always the most efficient way to run a project, at least on Mac and Windows. I'd like to talk about abstracting the Docker away and how you can make it more approachable for new members of your team. And also a possible new file sync approach that I just recently thought of. So story behind Docker Magento. So I first started working on it and working on Magento 2 back in 2015, the start of it. And it was insanely hard to get set up. Magento 1 was the de facto standard at the time. 2.0 was real buggy, and it took some time to figure out. And everyone had trouble installing and configuring it. So I also had some frustrations working with a contractor, building out custom modules for a couple projects I was working on, and just getting M2 to work. And also, Magento 1 ran on PHP 5. And Magento 2, when it launched, it ran on PHP 5 and 7 at the time, which was a big selling feature. And containerization was new. So Docker was pretty new. I think I just heard about it like in April 2015. So it was just a few months later, I kind of just dove into it, just like I do building out my courses. Big research and discover phase, and it was probably the worst 2 weeks of my life. it was awful. You can imagine how hard it is sometimes to work with it today, and imagine like 9 years ago, 8.5 years ago. So here's my first commit. I found it. It was in September of 2015. So I started working with it in June and July, and then it took me a few months to actually get it kind of stable and working. And I like to tag stuff as 1.0 right when it's done. So my first tag was shortly after that in December. It was just a README file and a YAML file. It was nothing else. I created it for myself. I never thought anyone else would even touch it or use it or hear about it. I didn't even tweet about it, nothing. I just pushed it out. And then a few months later, almost a year after I started, I got my first PR merged in. They were just bumping some releases. Remember, it was just a Docker file. There were no custom images or anything, so I just used official images. I thought it was cool. Just kind of went from there. And here's today. There's 62 contributors, including myself. It's pretty crazy how big it went. And the growing never stopped. It's over 2,000 stars now. I think it was 2,300 this morning. And yeah, it's crazy. And this is how many times Magento died during the development of it. And I heard over and over again that Magento is dead. So I'd like to talk about file system limitations, though, and the workarounds. So I want to rewind a bit. And this is really the biggest problem with Docker and with running it with Magento. My solution worked, but it was slow. It was very slow. I still ran it every day, but it was slow because of the volume mounts from the host to the container. And the problem was exaggerated with Magento being over 100,000 files and folders with Zen Framework. But why would something like this happen? Well, files exist on the host, and they also need to exist within the container. And the container is a completely isolated environment. You can think of it as sort of like a VM that is just completely standalone from your host system. So how do you get the files from the host to the container? Well, Docker is known as a client-server architecture. Docker desktop fits into the client piece. And then there's a Docker daemon that runs on the server side. And you can sort of think of it as like an API of a client that calls an API, which is the server. It wants it to do something, and then it returns a result. So that's kind of how Docker works. There's the client and the daemon. And this is why Docker desktop exists, because it doesn't exist, or it doesn't need to exist on a Linux system. It's because the client file system simulates a Linux kernel. And it's how systems like Ubuntu can actually run on a Mac. It's a complete simulation of almost the hardware that it runs. But it's also a limitation of Docker desktop. And Mac OS, it's based on Unix, but not Linux, and the two are not the same. So that's why we need that. And it usually works pretty well, unless you have 100,000 files and folders. and then it's pretty noticeable. So we need these folders synced somehow. So that first directory is my local client host system that has my Magento document or documents, and then there's the directory on the container, which Apache and Nginx need to look at. And those folders need to be synced. So how volume mappings work in Docker is that you'd set it up, and it syncs. And this host bind mounting is what syncs the files back and forth. But they can't only be synced one way. They also have to be synced the other way. Because if you want to remote into that container or SSH into it and change some files around, you want those same file system modifications to also appear back on the host. So there are a lot of solutions for this. Mutagen, I was one of the first ones to test Mutagen. I actually uploaded a YouTube video of me doing discovery work on it, and I accidentally deleted it. It worked great, kind of until it didn't. There were random halts, random shutdowns. Mutagen is just kind of a piece of client software that sits on your computer and syncs, and sometimes it just falls asleep. I'd walk away for a day or two and come back, start coding things up for like an hour, and then go and look at it, and nothing would be on the container. It would just, it just wasn't reliable. And it also has a slow first initial sync. So the first time you boot up the project, Mutagen would have to copy all of your files and folders over to the container, and at the time it took 10, 15 minutes. It's really not a great first-time user experience. So I'm sure it's improved since then, but there's a better way than things like Mutagen. And there's also alternate file systems. So people have experimented with NFS and OSXFS. Docker tried all different kinds of mounting. They came up with cached file system, which sort of had a way to cache the file system. And it used to be called delegated. It worked really well. We did notice some really big gains with that. But other solutions to this have just been incremental improvements. 5 to 10% improvements won't really improve the performance of Magento on a system like that on Docker. So maybe there's another way. And if you think about first principles, the problem is with host bind mounts is that when you mount the entire folder like this, it will sync all files and folders. So all 100,000, let's say, files and folders. So this is the bottleneck. And rather than doing this and host bind mounting one folder to the other, that arrow doesn't look good. We just want to pick the exact folder that we want to sync. So we only need to really sync app code, and app design, app Etsy, and also a few other places that need some syncing. So here's the compose.dev.yaml file. This file is merged in with the initial compose.yaml file at the time of starting the containers. And this is just how we define host bind volume mounts. So you have the host, you have a colon, you have the container location, and then the type of volume mount it is. So these are all cached just for performance reasons. And this isn't restricted. This is really just a text file. So you can add more mounts. There's some commented out here that are common locations, and you can also add your own. The key was not adding in files that are hit on every single request. And I found the culprit, it's really the pub/index.php file. So that's the entry point for Nginx. So when someone makes a request, even if it's CSS files, if it's even any dynamically generated file, it hits that specific file. So if you don't host bind mount just that one file, you'll notice like a huge performance gain. And it's also why a lot of people set their xdebug breakpoints in Docker Magento on pub index, and they wonder why it doesn't work. It's because it's not syncing that specific file. So the solution is selective volume sync is what I call it. I wrote an entirely big blog post about it on my personal site. It's markshust.com. And you can notice the date on this, December 2018, so it took me a few years to figure this out. But I haven't heard of many other or any other systems actually taking this approach. And you'd think it's not that ideal as it's slightly complex, but it works. And you'd think there'd be limitations, but in reality, it just works. There's really no issues with it. And development is almost always done in the app code directory. You can create tons of subdirectories under that, and you're working with it. And if you do work in another folder besides app code and app design, you can actually just go ahead and add that location into that compose.dev.yaml file, and everything just works fine. So I kind of see this as a solved problem. And it really is, but there may be a better way. And I'll talk about it in just a little bit. First, I want to talk about containerization efficiency, specifically in regards to Docker Desktop. So even though the file system sync is essentially solved at this point, we do have some other problems. And they're specifically related to memory allocation and CPU resources by using Docker Desktop. So I found this post on Stack Overflow. I just Googled Docker memory issues, first thing that came up. Docker Desktop eats all memory and crashes. So that's a very common, at least it eating all the memory is a very common issue, or it used to be. Many have had issues. And you could see, I don't know if you could see it from there, it says 50,000 views. So this is not an isolated incident. It not only consumes memory and CPU, though, it also eats away and drains your batteries on your laptop. So I found out about something fairly new last year, and it's called OrbStack. And it's a complete Docker Desktop alternative. And I usually ignore any new news and software like this, but this was pretty compelling copy that it just say goodbye to slow and clunky containers. It's what I've been dealing with for years. There is a need to re-download Docker images and resync volumes after you install it, but other than that, it's a complete one-to-one drop-in replacement. And it just works. It's completely free for personal use, and it works fantastic. And it's got a simpler UI than Docker Desktop. And again, it just works. It's cleaner, it looks better, and it also has Kubernetes support built in. And the battery life on my M1 Max laptop went from like 2.5 hours to 6 hours by switching just to OrbStack. And that's with the site consistently running. And the CPU usage went from like 20% to 0.5%. It's crazy. And I tweeted this out. It got over 1,000 likes and 300,000 views, so I guess people liked it. It's probably one of my most popular tweets ever. And this also caused Docker Desktop to fix their software. So this is just 3 or 4 months after I heard of OrbStack, this post came out. And this is after years of people asking Docker Desktop to try to fix their software, because we all knew it was broken. It's funny what a little fire can do. But I still use OrbStack, even though I did download Docker Desktop just a couple weeks ago. CPU usage went from like 25% down to 2%. OrbStack's still sitting at 0.5%. So it's still better. It's still faster to boot up the daemon or the Docker Desktop client software. And I really have no reason to switch back to it because OrbStack just works fine. But can performance be improved? I'll have you wait a little bit longer. One more thing I want to talk about is abstracting the Docker away. So this was another big initiative of Docker Magento once it started to pick up some steam. And there is a problem using Docker, and it begins with your team needing to know how to use it. And these are all the commands of the Docker command line. It's pretty crazy. And I'd ask you to go tell your team, hey, let's just use Docker, and then watch what happens. You'll have never-ending, just, I don't know what anything does, I don't know how to do anything. Which containers are running, right? It's docker-compose ps. It's like, I don't know what that is. Why not just use bin/status? So that's the idea behind the bash helper scripts that I wrote in Docker Magento. Why not just use human language so we can understand it and keep things simple and abstract all the Docker away? So again, it's just first principles, just make it easy to use, and then people will know how to use it. And it's just a simple bash script. So you just have what's called a shebang in the first line, and then you have the command line that you want to run. So this runs docker-compose ps. So it's abstracting that away, but you can see how simple it is. And there's no need to learn Docker or its terminology if you just know how to use the helper scripts. You just need to learn all of these scripts. And it can get pretty more complex. So here's a 55-line bash script that was written. It took some time to get to this point, but you can do pretty much complex things. You can pass in arguments to these scripts. This one enables and disables xdebug. So if you've ever had to do that on your system and go in PHP ini files, toggle the line, restart the services. This does this all just by running bin/xdebug. And there's also helpful messages here that tell you what to pass in and if you don't pass any in. So you could just run bin/xdebug toggle, and toggles it on or off, and it works awesome. And there are many helper commands. So my command list might even be longer than Docker applies, but they do a lot of things, and some of them are pretty powerful. But they're all well documented on GitHub. And I think there's a helper somewhere in here. I forgot what it is because I never use it, but it'll actually output all of these right from command line and tell you what they are, just like how they appear. But there's no weird or arcane syntax. It's just bin/whatever. And there's even an alias, bin/Magento. It works exactly the same way. It's just executed from your main directory outside of your source code. So there's this src/bin/Magento, and then there's the one that's the helper script. But it works in exactly the same way. And what these pretty much do is pipe commands to the Docker container. So you're actually executing them within the container. And finally, on the last topic, so probably the most interesting though. So I want to revisit the file sync in Docker. And the current approach just works fine. I really don't have any problems with it, but it's really not ideal because everything isn't syncing. So is there a way we can drastically improve the file sync? Again, trying to get to that next paradigm shift, what I did with the selective volume sync. So what can we do? So if you remember the whole reason I started Docker Magento, it's because I had a site using the RWD theme, and I had another Magento 2 site using Luma, and one ran PHP 5, one ran PHP 7. But we no longer have to deal with this problem because Magento 2.4.4 and higher just runs PHP 8. Now there are versions of PHP 8.1, 0.2, and 0.3 will be out soon. You do have different versions, but there are ways to toggle off those specific versions on or off, depending on the site you're using and the package. There's really easy helper commands on Mac. But we still have this problem of Nginx and PHP. So how does this work? They're really two completely separate services and apps. And when you make a request, it hits Nginx, the web server. It detects if it's a PHP file, and then it calls PHP FPM, which is a bunch of workers that run in the background, process the PHP, and then return the response back to Nginx. And that's what you see in your web browser. So is it possible to merge the two? It's kind of possible, but you can actually take it a step further. What if there's one app that can combine the web server and PHP? And this is the premise of Franken PHP. I don't know if you've heard of it. It kind of went crazy like a week or two ago on Twitter. In the Laravel world, someone just announced this. And yeah, it's just a modern server. It's faster than Nginx. And it has native PHP support built in, and it's a single app. So it runs on Caddy web server. And the configuration is actually much simpler than Nginx, so it's easier to use. And it's built on Go, so it runs, I believe, Go routines in the background to process requests quicker. And it also has support for HTTP 3. It has automatic SSL cert generation and automatic HTTPS. And it has native PHP extension support. And the best part is, there is no web server and PHP. It's just Franken PHP. It's one app. So how does this affect Docker Magento? So if you remember this slide where we have that host-bound sync, the idea is just to get rid of it. And here's how it would work. So you would remove the file and folder sync and keep all files native completely on the host. There's no need to move for any files or folders in the container at all. So you would not use or send files over to any containers. You'd keep databases, such as MySQL, Redis, and RabbitMQ, in separate containers. And you would manage domains and HTTPS directly through Franken PHP. So you can use whatever you would want to use on your appropriate host. And that means you can update the configuration like app.env.php to talk to the services within the containers. So all of your other random services, Magento has a lot of them, and they keep expanding them, like even Elasticsearch, that can still function through Docker containers. So you are still abstracting away, but you don't have to deal with the sync. So the best code is no code, and I think the best way to sync is just don't sync. So when can this happen? I do need your help. I would love to do this. I don't think it's going to be actually overly difficult. It would be great to have some kind of interface or command that set up these domains on your host for you. Yeah, check out the repo on GitHub if you don't have it. Just my name /docker-magento. And I would love to take in a PR and work with you to try to get this done. And I do have a free course on my Docker Magento setup if you want to check it out. It's 30 lessons. It's real easy to watch, and it's just a complete video lessons of how to manage and orchestrate Docker and Magento on your system. So just want to know if there's any questions. Hope you enjoyed the chat.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Sure.
Hi, hello, Mark.
Hello.
Thank you very much, first of all, for all this work you did, because it's a lot of developers who uses that, especially the local development. My question is not really related to the presentation, but just wanted to ask you a simple question. Why there is no varnish machine on your local development? Is there any reason? And because I didn't find an answer anywhere, so
yes. There's been 1 or 2 PRs come in for varnish integration. I purposely kept it out because it adds a lot of complexity to the setup. And I almost see varnish as a production, something you would just enable on production. So just had to make that trade-off, whether the complexity is worth pulling that in. There's been a lot of PRs I've rejected simply because they don't align with how I want Docker Magento to be, which is very simple and straightforward. But there are forks of it. You should be able to find them. I should link them in the README. I think I've asked people to create PRs with links to their forks that have those, so you can easily pull those in.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And more questions we have? Okay. Thank you very much once again, Mark. Thank you.